What's up everybody, Jeff here, and we're back for some more Rule of Cool. This time around, we're talking about the Guild. So if you're not familiar with this series, what we're going to do is go over every master that's available in the Guild, and go into a little bit about their background while showing some pretty pictures of art and models, so you can get a better idea of what they're like, and maybe help you decide which master you want to play in the game. In addition to that, Sam from the Danger Planet is going to touch a little bit on how the masters play, in case that's something that's going to help you decide. We've already covered the Arcanist, the Ten Thunders, and the Bayou in the series, so don't forget to check out those videos, and we're planning to get to the rest of the factions in the near future, so stay tuned. On that note, don't forget to drop a like if you find this video helpful, and don't forget to hit subscribe so that you don't miss the stuff that's coming up. In addition, check out all the links in the description. We got the Discord where you can come hang out with me and the rest of the community, as well as the Weird affiliate link, which will allow you to make purchases on the Weird's web store if you want to pick up any of these guild masters, and the channel gets a little kickback if you purchase through that link. On top of that, we got the merch store, as well as the Patreon where you can get a whole bunch of different benefits, but with that, I'll stop talking and we'll get into it. Lady Justice has a mysterious background, and some even say that she was once a necromancer herself. When the breach reopened and the guild established their foothold in Malifaux City, it wasn't long before the scourge of the necromancers rose again. These necromancers raised the undead, and were even bold enough to attack the Governor General himself. In response to this threat, the guild started the Death Marshals, one of their special divisions to combat the Resurrectionists. Lady Justice was put in charge. Her Death Marshal's close proximity to necromancy has tainted them, but their efforts to fight off the regular attacks from necromancers has caused them to be very popular among the people. Lady Justice has achieved a celebrity status, though no matter how many resurrectionists they defeat, there always seem to be more. After many years of hunting a mysterious necromancer, Lady Justice finally tracked down Nicodem, and though she defeated him, her colleague and lover, the Judge, was killed as well. This was a serious emotional blow, and to make matters worse, it was also discovered that Douglas McMorning, the guild's coroner, had been doing necromancy right under her nose. Justice took this personally, and with increased pressure from the guild to crack down on the more powerful necromancers, she's now set out on the hunt with more fury than ever. Lady Justice is one of the cooler masters within the guild. While most of the guild has a pretty bad reputation among the people, Lady Justice and the Death Marshals are one of the exceptions to that. They're really well regarded, and the people will actually cheer them on the streets when they see them going after some resurrectionists. Death Marshals are also a specific model in the game, and they're one of the more iconic Malifaux models that you'll definitely have seen if you've ever looked at any of the first edition art. They're like cowboys with flaming blue skulls and a coffin strapped to their back. Justice herself is pretty badass. She's a blind sword fighter, and she's actually still able to sort of see using some necromantic ability that she has. A lot of the rest of the crew also focuses on countering the undead and sort of dark powers, and it's definitely one of the cooler looking guild crews in my opinion. But with that, let's go over to Sam from the Danger Planet, who's going to talk a little bit about how the crew plays.
Now, Lady Justice is one of the most iconic masters in the game. She's the blind swordsman, the leader of the Martial Division, and as you might expect, she's an incredibly powerful melee killer. Pretty unsubtle. She leaps around. She's durable. She heals herself in a variety of different ways. She does huge damage. She's a minimum 3 damage attack with crit strike. So she's pretty strong. Her keyword's also pretty unsubtle. The Marshals are surprisingly durable with hard to wound and a lot of healing, and they have pretty good ranged attacks. Some of them also have the interesting Pine Box ability, which when you use it, it buries an enemy model, and then they can unbury themselves, but it takes them off the board temporarily. And Lady Justice 2, her title form, really leans into this Pine Box type gameplay where you really want to bury enemies and clutter up the board with these coffin markers. There's a little sub-theme here too where a lot of martial models have extra abilities if the enemy is an undead model or if they're near undead models. And the coffin markers that Lady Justice 2 makes let even non-undead enemies be treated as undead. So even if your opponent isn't playing, resurrectionists, you still have this opportunity to use all their cool special rules.
After coming back to Malifaux, the guild soon found that they were threatened by their prison laborers who were manifesting magical abilities. They cracked down on unsanctioned use of magic, and formed the Witch Hunters to regulate and police its use. To head up this special division, they found Sonia Crit, a woman with magical abilities, who was privately hunting for relics and magical items from old Malifaux. She agreed to take the job, because it would allow her access to all of the guild's findings, and she could even keep some of the relics for herself. Unlike Lady Justice and the Death Marshals, Sonia Crit and the Witch Hunters have a horrible reputation among the people, as their tactics are not always the friendliest. They've been known to snatch people from their beds and make entire families disappear. And though many aren't aware of it, the witchling stalkers that they employ to hunt down mages are actually former mages who've had their identities and personalities burned away from them. But their enemies are very powerful and often resort to terrorism, meaning that the witch hunters always have to stay on their toes. Sonia Crit was previously the host of the tyrant Sharufe, who almost destroyed her until her friends came to save her, applying a magical mask that held back the tyrant's influence. After many years of living in this difficult situation, Sharufe then abandoned her when he sensed that the Governor General was trying to ascend to tyranthood himself. The two entities merged together, forming the Burning Man, almost killing Sonia Crit in the process and leaving her horribly scarred. Dr. McMorning was able to reconstruct her face, and she recovered, though she'd been changed forever. When the Burning Man finally returned to Malifaux, Sonia sensed a familiar presence and set out to try to defeat the strange entity. Sonia Crit is a fire witch with a big sword. She's definitely ruthless, and obviously doesn't care about what people think about her. She's willing to do whatever it takes to get the job done. Her crew is full of both mages, who are legally using magic under the guild's law, as well as sort of enslaved people who've been forced to do Sonia's bidding and combating the other mages. It's a little bit dark, to be honest, but that's Malifaux for you. But with that, let's go back over to Sam for some more information about how Sonia Crit and the Witch Hunters play.
Sonia Crit, she's another very unsubtle master. Sonia loves fire and she loves burning people. Both versions of her do this. Now, the Witch Hunter keyword is interesting because it has this little sub-keyword called Witchlings. There's Witchling Handlers, Witchling Thralls, regular Witchling Stalkers. And Witchlings, they don't have any kind of special Witchling universal rules, but there are certain buffs that work on Witchlings or work better on Witchlings. So sometimes when you're building your crew, you'll see that there are models that are useful, but if you are taking Witchlings, they're even better. As for the crew itself, it loves to hand out burning. It's got tons and tons of burning. Sonia is surprisingly tough given that she's defense 4 because she has Arcane Shield and Counterspell, and really her great powerful key ability is Smothering Flames, which is if the enemy is within line of sight, all the range on their actions is reduced by the value of their burning condition, as long as it's not a melee action. So you can really screw people over by just like shrinking their buff auras, shrinking their buff, ranges, shrinking their ranged attacks so that they can't hit you back. Sonia's got a 14-inch range gun that inflicts burning automatically if it damages the target, and has a built-in trigger to inflict even more burning with Blaze. So you can really stack the burning pretty high, and once it's stacked up, the enemy has a real devil of a time like getting through to you. She also has the ability to burn somebody out by reducing their burning condition and dealing damage equal to the value, and if she kills them, she turns them into a Witchling. Now, her title form is still pretty much, very into burning. She kind of wants friendly models to be on fire a bit more. With Channeled Flame, she can reduce the value of the burning condition on a friendly model to get a plus twist to that duel. And to help her do that, she has the ability to drop pyre markers. A lot. She has a ton of pyre markers she can throw around the board. When her ranged attack would do blasts, she could drop pyre markers instead, which is pretty cool. And her pyre markers are treated as severe, and enemies can never ignore them. So even if the enemy is normally incorporeal or ignores hazardous, nope. Still take the burning from higher markers, which it's pretty strong. It adds up a lot of damage, and it also just really lets her punch through the damage no matter what your opponent is trying to do.
Perdita Ortega came to Malifaux to join a guild program hunting Neverborn monsters for money. Most people didn't make it very long in this program, but Perdita was extremely good at it. She was so successful that she was able to pay to have the rest of her family join her in Malifaux, and soon her legend had spread far and wide, inspiring tall tales about her ability to bend bullets and shoot with her eyes closed. She's now in charge of the monster hunters, and she's brought the rest of her family outside of Malifaux City to form a compound and headquarters known as Latigo. Perdita has become the head of the family, in spite of the fact that she's not the oldest, and she and the rest of her relatives hunt bounties and keep the monsters at bay. She seems to have some strange connection with the Neverborn, and she's the only person who's been known to have taken one captive and bent it to her will. The Latigo compound is near the Red Cage Pit, which is pouring out undead and mechanical monsters and pulling away the attention of the Ortegas. Meanwhile, the Neverborn have had shifts in power, leading to the rise of Nakima and the re-emergence of the Fey Queen Titania. While they now have a lot on their plate, at the very least, this ensures that the Ortegas will be employed for a long time. Perdita and the family keyword are really fun. They definitely have the cowboy aesthetic going if that's something that you're interested in with Malifaux. And it's one of the crews that really focuses on named characters, though they do have some more generic members as well. But all those characters are fun because they all have their own personalities and stories in the lore. Perdita also doesn't really seem to get along with most of the other members of the guild, and they tend to not be involved with a lot of the things that are going on in the guild headquarters, because they're kind of off doing their own thing. But the crew has a real focus on gunslinging, and almost everybody in the crew is going to be wielding a pistol, and they tend to be a pretty good shot with it. Then there's Abuela, who's in a wheelchair and wielding a shotgun, so that's just awesome. But on that note, let's go back over to Sam, who's going to talk a little bit about how Perdita and the family play.
Perdita is really straightforward. She's got a great gun and she knows how to use it. Now, her whole keyword has a little bit of synergy with the concentrate action. They've got bravado, so they can push towards enemies as they concentrate, but they also have Op or L, which lets them discard a card at the end of their activation, to let another nearby model take an action as long as their cost is less than the model that was acting. That's a really strong ability. Trading bad cards for AP is very good, although the crew doesn't have that many cards or card draw, so you have to be careful with that. A lot of family models are very tough. They have strong attacks, Peacebringer guns. Francisco's got a really powerful sword. A lot of them have crit strike. So you really have a lot of ability to just punch hard and do a bunch of damage. Not particularly subtle, but just a very efficient crew that can use its AP very well. Perdita Ortega Neverborn Hunter is much more of a support model. She has these really cool upgrades, these specialty upgrades that she can hand out either to freshly summoned pistoleros, which are, not great, but if they kill something, they can kind of upgrade themselves to monster hunters. Or she can give those to friendly family models as well. And these specialty upgrades are all kind of a special form of training that one of the models can get that gives it new abilities. So if you need to give someone, the ability to ignore incorporeal, you can do that. You can let people ignore terrain. They're kind of like counter tech against different things your opponent might be bringing. And you have the ability to kind of switch it up on the fly, pick a new upgrade to hand out to people. And so you can react to what your opponent's doing turn to turn. It's definitely a playstyle that really supports a flexible mindset and the ability to turn on the fly and make a new plan.
Charles Hoffman is the head of the Guild's Amalgamation Office, the department that enforces the law against using living parts inside of mechanical constructs. He does his job well, but his life has been full of tragedies. When he traveled through the breach to Malifaux, he was met with a terrible accident that almost cost his brother Ryle his life. He was saved by Victor Ramos, who augmented his body with mechanical limbs and organs, leaving the man as a shadow of his former self. The transit through the breach awakened a power within Charles. He now had a powerful ability to control mechanical constructs, using only his thoughts. He worked tirelessly over the years to restore his brother to his former self, but slowly he began to realize that his brother was really gone. Eventually he was able to admit it to himself, and he laid his brother to rest. Soon the Arcanists approached Hoffman and asked for his help in tracking down amalgamations that Ramos had created and hidden away before he was arrested. This was a sore spot for the man, and he agreed to help, knowing that he was cooperating with enemies of the Guild. Charles Hoffman is the robot master. Almost his entire crew is comprised of constructs, and they come in all shapes and sizes. It can be a lot of fun to march a slow and steady army of robots up the board, and they all tend to be really tanky, but they also have some tricks that they can do as well. Charles himself is interesting because he's definitely one of the more sympathetic guild masters, in that you don't see him out there victimizing innocent people, or being too authoritarian. He seems to actually care about people, and he tries to stop people from being abused by being made into amalgamations. But with that, let's go back over to Sam, who's going to talk a little bit about how Hoffman and the augmented keyword work in the game.
Charles Hoffman and the augmented keyword are all about big robots. There are two versions of Hoffman, but the thing they have in common is power tokens. Power tokens are tokens that most of the models in this crew can obtain by removing a scrap marker, although there are a few other ways to do it. They basically function like a soul stone in some ways. They can add a plus twist to a duel, or they can add a suit, but any model can use them. So even minions and enforcers that can't spend soul stones can use power tokens. Now, the keyword tends to be, as you might expect, beefy, very heavily armored, strong, powerful attacks with high damage. They're not super hard to hit because, low defenses, they rely on their armor. So if the enemy can pierce their armor, then they might be in some trouble. But they can be surprisingly quick. There are some interesting sort of ways that they can move. And of course, you've got the Watchers that fly very quickly. And they can also pass power tokens between each other and push each other around. This is a very synergistic crew where the models are buffing each other and handing out power tokens to each other and giving each other focus and fast and things. Now, Charles Hoffman Inventor, the title version, is a bit more taking things into his own hands. He creates these pylon markers, which are these big markers that are not destructible but do block a line of sight, so it's difficult for your opponent to get around them. And then he can shoot lightning bolts of irreducible damage at enemy models. And he actually has a pretty good melee attack too. So Hoffman 1 is a bit more about buffing his robots. Hoffman 2 is a bit more about mad science, using these pylons and his powerful attacks to kill enemies. His crew just generally is going to be a bunch of powerful robots with high armor. So if you can't ignore armor, you're going to have a hard time dealing with them. But if you can, you'll find that they go down surprisingly quickly because in Malifaux, most models with armor have low health to compensate.
Nelly Cochran has always been passionate about journalism. She made a name for herself working on a small newspaper, and it attracted the attention of the Guild. The Guild's Department of Public Relations keeps a tight watch on all forms of media in Malifaux. They directly control most of the media outlets, using them to spread propaganda and censoring any critics. So when the Guild offered Nelly a job as the editor-in-chief of the Malifaux Tattler, she knew it would come with some restrictions on her content, a sacrifice she was willing to make. At this much larger publication, Nelly continues to work, exposing corruption and cruelty across Malifaux, except for within the guild. She accepts this arrangement due to the fact that there are plenty of other bad things to report on, and how bad could the guild be anyway? Though her position attracts the ire of many of the guild's enemies, they're hesitant to do anything about it because of the potential damage that Nelly could do with her mastery of the printing press. When the Burning Man arrived in Malifaux, Nelly happened upon a copy of the Fumé, a magical and insidious book that spreads the corruption of the Burning Man. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she read it cover to cover, becoming enthralled and fascinated with the message it spread. Now, the writing at the Tattler has become more erratic, and many at the guild have become concerned for its editor-in-chief. Nelly and her crew are really unique when it comes to wargames, but to talk a little bit more about why you might find them interesting, let's hear from Doug from Steam-Powered Scoundrels.
Okay, I've been nicely asked to talk about the journalist keyword. Journalist is one of the quintessential Malifaux keywords, in that it represents the fact that this game is not just about beating up your opponent, but about scoring points and winning. It's up there with Performer in that only one of the models and Journalist is actually armed. So I think a few of them have damaging attacks, but on the models, really it's only Fiona, and the rest are just reporters and news-related people. Nelly Cochran herself is pretty much dedicated to be as annoying as possible for your opponent, both versions. She has some pretty painful ambient abilities, and back of card is dishing out a bunch of negative effects, obeys, and Nelly 1 has a mid to late game nuke, one of the few uncapped damage actions in the game. Fiona is the team anchor and the only one there to just take punches and deal them out. Alison Dade is just a miniature Nelly and kind of there to project Nelliness on another part of the board she's not on. The Undercover Reporter is one of the most iconic models in the guild, and just real nasty with how you can disrupt your opponent. August Hart is a pseudo-beater and disruption model that best utilizes Nelly 2's ability to dish out Distracted. Field Reporters are great scheme runners that are really difficult to put down. False Witnesses are one of the most obnoxious abilities in the game, you just gotta be careful with it. Newsies are cheap and easy to put down, but if you ignore them, the throw newspaper action is just obnoxious in that it deals plink damage and distracted and discarding cards. So yeah, overall, annoy and disrupt your opponent instead of defeating them and win that way.
Thanks so much for that, Doug. Don't forget to check out the Steam-Powered Scoundrels podcast, which I'll put a link to in the description, as well as the Artefactors Union, which is Doug's YouTube channel where he does assembly guides for Malifaux kits. It's super helpful, so be sure to check it out. But with that, let's go back over to Sam to talk about Nelly and the journalist keyword.
Nelly is a lot of fun. She's a journalist, as you might expect from the title. She's a real muckraker, and her keyword is not that damaging, although it does have some surprising ability to do damage. A lot of it's just focused on interacting and scheming. You see, they all have the exclusive interview ability, where if you interact with an or two of them, they actually control your interact action, which means you can never do the thing you want to do when you interact. Nelly's also got some interesting ability to inflict conditions like slow, stun, distracted. Her whole keyword really leans into that, which is good because they don't do that much damage, although Fiona Gage has a surprisingly strong pickaxe. Nelly Cochran, Voice of Disorder, is much more of a condition spreader and debuffer. She can spread friendly and enemy conditions around to nearby journalists or enemy models, so you can, if one of your friendly models gains fast or gains focused, you can share it, and if an enemy model would gain slow or distracted or stunned, you can spread that to another enemy model as well. And she also has the ability to stack Distracted on friendly models, which is really good with August Hart, who loves being distracted. Even then, teleport them across the board with False Reality, which is a very strong action that has an almost unlimited range teleport. It's double the target's distracted condition plus 2 inches, but there's no cap on distracted, so you can get distracted up to 9 and get like a 20-inch teleport. It's a lot of fun.
Lucius Matheson is secretary to the Governor General of Malifaux. He's also a lawyer, a fencer, and is accomplished in many other fields, though no one seems to know where he came from before he was working his way up the guild ladder. The man is always wearing a mask, and few people, if any, have ever seen his real face. In reality, he's actually a creature of the Neverborn, but like his human companions, the other Neverborn don't really understand his true nature. It's not really clear where Lucius's loyalties really lie, but he spent the last decade manipulating the power structure within the guild to suit his own ends. He manipulated Governor General Kitchener in his quest for more power, and after the man's death, he was disappointed when he wasn't able to turn the situation to his own favor. The new Governor General stepped in, and was immediately less susceptible to Lucius's manipulations. This has put him on the outs among the guild's power structure, though there are still many who owe their loyalties only to him. The arrival of the Burning Man was a surprise to Lucius, and he found its chaotic ways to be troublesome, as they've confounded his carefully laid plans. Lucius is another one of those masters who's a little different than what you normally expect in a wargame. He's got a crew that's full of lawyers and bureaucrats, who use unusual abilities to control their opponents, although he's definitely got a more militaristic edge than a crew like Nelly's. The other half of his crew is interesting because they're from the Neverborn, and they all tend to be the types of Neverborn that can change shape and imitate people, which goes right along with his theme of subterfuge and deceit. Lucius is one of the most interesting characters in the lore, and I think his crew really reflects that. They're really unique looking and a lot of fun. But let's go over to Sam, who's going to tell us a little bit more about how they play.
Lucius Matheson. The Elite Division have a lot of really interesting scheme marker tricks. They have a lot of benefits with staggered, synergy with staggered, especially with their garrote attacks. And they also have some cool ability to kind of mess with your opponent with things like a diversion aura, obeys. Lawyers, I think, are especially worth a call out here as being very strong models with tools for the job, and in both obey and impassioned defense. Usually you're obeying friendly models to let them take extra actions, but impassioned defense is also pretty strong in that regard. You can keep your models safe. The mimic half of the keyword is more tricky. You've got these models like the doppelganger that can copy other models' actions, which is very strong when you're copying really strong, good guns. Lucius is all about kind of manipulating the board, moving his own models around, drawing cards when anyone uses a pass token, and making other models take actions outside their activations. And Lucius 2, on the other hand, is almost like a melee version of Seamus. He can teleport around the board to blocking terrain, pop out, and then shred people with his huge claw. It's a very strong attack, the dagger-like claw, and especially if the target is staggered. He leans into that staggered synergy we talked about.
Sergeant Deel Barker never wanted to be an officer. He preferred to keep his head down and stay out of the limelight, content to work for a living, and just bring home a paycheck for roughing up some Arcanists. He had the respect of the other troops, and that was good enough for him. But he caught the attention of Lucius Matheson, who saw him as an ideal underling, a man who would get the job done, but not ask too many questions. Working for Lucius saw him promoted to captain, and he worked many assignments under Lucius, though the records of those operations are sealed. Pretty soon, his numerous accomplishments stacked up, and when Governor General Marlowe took over, he promoted him to commander. He's now in charge of the entire guild guard, which is more of an administrative position, something that annoys Barker. Paperwork and desk duty are not his forte, even if the paycheck that comes with it is much bigger. When the Burning Man came to Malifaux, Deel finally took the opportunity to pass the administrative work off onto some of the assistants, and head out to the streets to crack some heads. Deel Barker is basically just a meathead that likes to break things. But it actually makes him a kind of interesting character compared to some of the other guild masters because he's pretty straightforward, whereas the rest of them are always up to something and scheming. His crew is pretty cool looking because most of them look pretty much like something you might see in real life. It's a bunch of beat cops, some are mounted on horses, and some are marksmen. Then there's some exceptions like the executioners, but they're some of the most iconic models in Malifaux. But now let's go back to Sam to talk a little bit more about how the guard keyword plays.
Now, Dashel is the guild's biggest summoner. He is basically the captain of the guild's guard, and so when he summons, he's calling in the guard. The key with him is you really need his totem alive, because Dashel removes scheme markers to summon, and if it's an enemy scheme marker, the TN on the summon is reduced, which you really need to summon your best and strongest options, but enemies won't always drop an enemy scheme marker for you, so that's where the dispatcher comes in. He can be treated as one, and when you would remove him to summon, you draw a card. So he gives you reliable summons and card draw. Now, Dashel has a lot of different models he can summon. Most guard are better at range than in melee, although there are exceptions, like the executioners, and the guard sergeant is a bit better in melee than range since his update. And they tend to not be that strong, with, of course, the exception of the executioners, but there is a lot of, different guard models you can summon, a lot of little specialists, and you can fill a lot of roles with them. So really what you're doing is you're just calling in the guard, summoning, and then focusing fire on models that have already activated to benefit from the guard's pursue ability, which gives them +1 to hit targets that have already activated. Now, if you want to change things up a little, you can play Dashel 2, also called Bashel, who really just wants to get into melee with his axes and carve things up. He's about as unsubtle as a master gets, but he has a 7-inch charge, he can charge up to 3 times per activation, and he can just make a mess of things. So he also can summon guard, which is kind of neat. It's a trigger on one of his actions, so it's not necessarily something you're really doing, but it's nice when it happens.
Cornelius Bas never wanted to work for the guild. He grew up in Oklahoma, and as he got older, he became accustomed to frontier life. He associated with vagabonds, bandits, and settlers, though he always found that he had a strong moral compass. Soon he had acquired a reputation for delivering frontier justice, and he settled down and married a woman who gave him a daughter. Soon his wife died, and he was left to raise his daughter Bernadette by himself. He tried to instill his morals in her, but also taught her the importance of self-defense, and when she got into an altercation with a judge's son, who pulled a knife on her, these lessons proved valuable. The boy died in the fight, and Bas wasn't willing to leave his daughter's fate to the justice system, so they ran away from America to Malifaux. There, the guild called for Bas, and made him an offer that he couldn't refuse. Either he would be deputized, and help them patrol the settlements outside of Malifaux City, or they would deport him and his daughter back to the United States, where justice was waiting for them. I really enjoy the father-daughter duo that Bas has going on. They're really interesting characters in the lore, and I definitely recommend you check out their stories. Their whole crew really leans into the sort of Western and frontier theme that the game has a reputation for, probably more so than any other crew in the game. You got cowboys and trappers and frontiersmen and all sorts of cool stuff. Plus there's a giant sandworm, which is pretty awesome. It's one of the more interesting looking crews in my opinion that doesn't look entirely unrealistic, and I think they're a lot of fun to paint and model. But let's go back to Sam, who's going to fill us in on how to play Frontier.
Cornelius Bas and the Frontier keyword. Now, this is a keyword that's very much about terrain and markers, and specifically, it's about dust cloud markers. Dust cloud markers are a special kind of marker that almost every model in this crew can kick up with the kick up dust action. They're 50mm markers that are concealing and severe. So they create concealment, and of course they're difficult to move through. But they're just little clouds of dust, so at the end of the turn they go away. Now, not every model can ignore these markers, and most models don't ignore concealment. So it's a very gun-heavy crew, but you have to be aware of the concealment you're creating. You don't want to penalize your own shooting by doing that. Bas himself, his original version, has some very interesting terrain synergies where he wants to be near terrain and he can attack enemies if they're near terrain. In keeping with his frontier aesthetic, the whole crew has this ability, Home on the Range, and that basically extends your deployment zone, but the key is it extends your deployment zone for everyone who has the ability more based on how many models have the ability. So if you only have 3 Home on the Range models, each of those models can deploy 3 inches past your crew's deployment zone. But if you have 7 or 8, each of those models can deploy 7 or 8 inches beyond your deployment zone, which means you can start pretty far up the board and control territory very quickly. And that really helps when you're using these little clockwork traps that Bas can hire and that his Pathfinders can make. Those are these little kind of weak traps that don't do much on their own, but you can summon them pretty easily and they can really pin your opponent in and make it hard for them to move around. Now, Bas's title version means that the dust cloud markers don't go away, and he also has an aura that lets his nearby models ignore concealment. So, you can use these markers much more aggressively to block lines of sight and to, defend your models with concealment because you can shoot through ignoring the concealment. He's also got a very interesting long-range gun that ignores hard to kill and a close-up attack that can inflict debilitating conditions. So this one's much more trying to get into your opponent's face and kind of lock them down with his melee attack and trap them with markers.
The King's Empire is a nation on Earth that has a complicated relationship with the Guild. But when the Burning Man arrived in London, bringing with it the gibbering hordes and the cult of the Burning Man, they destroyed the city and forced most human factions to cooperate. When the Burning Man arrived in Malifaux, the chaos it brought with it proved to be too much for the Guild presence there. The Governor General called for help from Earth, and the King's Empire was quick to send Harold Tull. He's an artillery specialist with the King's Empire, who developed a reputation for his unorthodox tactics that border on recklessness. He had accomplished many military feats with his unit, and he seemed to be the perfect choice to send to Malifaux to deal with the threat. Tull's practice with artillery has led to hearing problems, but sign language and other hand signals have proved to be valuable nonetheless. When a problem can't be solved with big guns, Tull and his unit can also employ stealth, sneaking up on their enemies, communicating silently, and using smoke to cover their movements. Hopefully all these tactics will be enough to counter the Burning Man. Harold Tull is the newest master in the Guild. His crew's really interesting because it's got a lot of stuff in it that we don't see a lot of in the Guild already. He's got 2 big artillery cannons, a construct that looks like it's right out of the King's Empire from the other side, jetpack troopers, and sappers. A lot of it looks like steampunk World War I, which I think is a really cool aesthetic. Harold Tull himself has a giant grenade launcher and a cat named Walter who's a sergeant. So obviously best master in the game. Now one more time, let's go over to Sam, who's going to talk a little bit about Harold Tull and how the Cavalier keyword plays.
Tull and the Cavalier keyword are pretty much all about artillery, or at least the original version is. He has these artillery markers he can drop that they can't be removed, and at the end of the turn he calls in a bombardment on those positions. He's also got a pretty strong grenade launcher, and he can use it to push enemies back, not doing damage, but staggering them and putting them out of the way. Now, Tull has some pretty interesting synergy with scheme markers as well, using the Heat of Battle ability that many of his keyword models have. It lets them discard a card to take an extra action if they're near a scheme marker at the end of their activation. You can create scheme markers the normal way, but the cards are the hard part. But a lot of models in his keyword have the ability to draw weak cards out of your discard pile, which you maybe aren't going to use to cheat, but you can discard to heat of battle. So it's a pretty strong ranged keyword, even though it's been nerfed a bit. And Herald Tull Dead Silent kind of mixes things up a little, and being, rather than having this very aggressive percussive barrage, Dead Silent is more about sneaking around. He has lots of ways to teleport models around and to teleport himself around. If an enemy attacks him, he can pop to a nearby scheme marker. He's also got some pretty good card draw as long as your models are taking non-charge general actions with their extra heat of battle actions. So you can be getting a bunch of focus, concentrate actions in, keeping that focus stacked, and still cycling cards through your hand. So he maybe doesn't have the same oomph as original Herald Tull, but don't count his gun out. It's pretty strong.
So that's it for every master and guild. Now, hopefully that gives you a little better sense of all of the masters and how they look and feel, and a little bit about how they play, so that you can decide which one of them is best for you. Picking a crew is one of the hardest things about this game, so hopefully this has been helpful for you. And if you have any painted models from other factions that you would like to submit for future videos, then shoot me an email at this link, and don't forget to let me know how to credit you in the video. I want to send a huge thanks to Doug from Steam-Powered Scoundrels. Don't forget to check out the Steam-Powered Scoundrels podcast, which is one of my favorites, as well as the Artefactors Union YouTube channel. It's a super helpful resource, even if you're a pro putting the models together. Just seeing how they go together before you actually start working on yours can be really helpful. I also want to thank Sam from the Danger Planet for the gameplay breakdowns. And a special thank you to the Extremely Cool Kids tier on Patreon, the Steam-Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatize, and Biclops Gladiator Games. Thanks.